All right, well, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Good morning, good afternoon to everybody on the call. Appreciate you joining us this afternoon. My name is Tony Walters. I'm the Executive Director of the National American Indian Housing Council. As you can see on the screen, hopefully you can see the screen, we have our agenda up. We're going to just talk about our updates for this Congress, some of the bills that are either introduced already or pending introduction. Some updates on some of the administration's programs that I know a lot of you have questions regarding, particularly the Treasury programs. And then we always end up with some announcements at the end. It's an open discussion, so feel free to interrupt or put something in the chat. Happy to answer questions as they come up. And hopefully, and if we don't have answers today, we'll certainly follow up for later calls or just getting answers back to you in the meantime before the next call. I know we wait usually a month between calls, so we try not to wait. If there's open questions, we'll try to get that information out to folks sooner than that. We no longer have really done our roll call, which we used to do when we were on a call, kind of smaller calls back then. Now that we've gone to Zoom, I think more people are joining. So we try not to do a full roll call, but certainly encourage everyone to chime in the chat, kind of say, where you're from or who you're representing. This is a recorded call, so I think we do have that chat transcript and I think the participant list, so we can always see who's participating, but certainly encourage everyone to have discussions in the chat. I monitor that as we go along, and I try to, if I see questions, I'll try to answer that or insert it into the discussion as it's appropriate. So certainly encourage folks to do that, and we want these calls to be interactive, and we want to answer the questions that you guys have moving forward. So with that, I'll just jump in. Kind of a little bit of a slow month this past month with respect to some bills. I know there's a lot of administrative things going on at the agencies, and we'll get to that. But overall, just some of the current housing bills that we've seen in Congress that are specific to tribal housing or have tribal housing provisions. There's not a whole lot that's been introduced quite yet. Still a little early. I think we're trying to get into the point where we would like to see a lot of our bills introduced. But the big one that I've seen that's come across or has been introduced in both the House and the Senate this Congress has been the American Housing and Economic Mobility Act. This is a national housing policy bill. It's kind of a progressive bill with a lot of Democratic sponsors and co-sponsors. This was introduced last Congress as well. Didn't make a lot of headway last Congress, but I think the idea is, each Congress you try to get a little further in the process. This is a larger national housing bill, but it does have some key provisions in there for tribes, including a NAHASDA reauthorization for 10 years. And the first year of that authorization, it actually specifically calls out $2.5 billion for NAHASDA Indian Housing Block Grant. So it's it'd be a good win for tribal housing. Of course, we know we've been underfunded, seeing NAHASDA programs underfunded for many years. But this would put a kind of a shot in the arm for our tribal housing programs. Another provision of the bill would allow tribes to regain access to the Section 8 housing voucher program. I know that's been a priority for a lot of our programs over the years. We've got some resolutions in regards to that issue. As you know, in the NAHASDA Act, there's some provisions there that restrict tribes from some of these HUD programs after NAHASDA was enacted as kind of the grand deal or bargain or agreement for tribes to get that consolidated block grant. So this would remove that restriction, and I think we've been looking kind of administratively and legislatively to remove any kind of restriction for tribes to access other housing programs, and we've been successful. Continuum of care was a big one last Congress that got passed, where tribes can now access that program directly. But there's a few others at HUD that are in similarly situated where tribes were kind of left out of a larger federal program just because there is a Indian housing block grant. And here we're trying to make efforts to make sure tribes have access to all the other housing programs that are there, particularly because NAHASDA has been fairly level funded over the years. So that's kind of the first bill that's out of the gate that we've seen that specifically includes tribes. We have a lot of other priorities as well. So I'll skip to the next slide. Just other tribal housing bills, just a NAHASDA update generally. So that bill does have a NAHASDA reauthorization for 10 years, but it's not the typical bill that we've seen that we've been working on regards to a full NAHASDA reauthorization. The recent bills that we've seen last Congress, both the Senate and the House, are a little bit different. So we've been working these first few months trying to figure out if we can get both sides to introduce an identical bill, or try to take all the best parts of both of those bills and have them introduced in both chambers, so you can get a little bit of momentum that way as well. And it's that way that people aren't confused, which one is a priority or which one may be better or worse. They were both really good bills last Congress, at both the House and Senate versions. Even though they had a few differences, they were both very good for tribal programs, but we're trying to consolidate those here. So we're working with their lead sponsors on both the Senate and the House. The Senate Committee for Indian Affairs is usually the lead committee for that bill. Been working, doing a little bit of outreach with Schatz's office, Chairman Schatz's office, and Ranking Member Murkowski's office to see what their timeline is, what type of hearing schedule they might have for tribal housing. We're still optimistic with those two kind of at the helm of that committee that they're going to find some common ground on the HAZA bill. There was a bipartisan bill last Congress, so they've got a good place to start from, and then hopefully move a bill out of committee into the full Senate floor. On the House side, still looking as well for kind of the lead sponsor. Gwen Moore, representative from Wisconsin, has been a strong ally for tribal housing programs for years and years. Was a lead sponsor of the bill a few Congresses ago. She's moved on from this committee. So she's no longer on our Financial Services Committee, which is where our bill goes through, but they did have a members hearing I think 2 weeks ago, where the Financial Services Committee invites other members of the House to testify about what priorities they think the committee should work on. Representative Gwen Moore was one of the few members to participate in that hearing, and she spent a good chunk of her time talking about NAHAZA program. So we certainly have some advocates and allies on the House side, and it's still a priority for a lot of members on the House. So that's kind of the NAHAZA update. Similar update for HUD-VASH. There's no bill that's been introduced yet. Still working with the sponsors and making sure that whatever gets introduced, we can get past this Congress. As many of you know, we've seen the bill pass the Senate in each of the last two Congresses, and then it's kind of not gotten passed in both a Republican and then a Democratic controlled House. So we're trying to figure out what the magic process is to get that across the finish line. But I think we're all hopeful that that's still something we can get done. It's a big priority for the Veterans Affairs Committee. They did have a roundtable, I think it was about 3 weeks ago, on veterans issues generally, and not just tribal issues, but we were included in that. And I spoke at that roundtable about the HUD-VASH bill, and then also just generally, issues affecting veteran housing issues. For a lot of our tribal communities, it's really based on just limited housing stock. And I know it's an issue for most tribes across the board, veteran or otherwise, but for our HUD-VASH program, with some of the restrictions that we've seen on where those vouchers are, what units those vouchers are eligible for, it becomes even a bigger issue on the housing shortage if you're not able to use all of the housing within the tribal community. So access to supportive services is also a big component of the HUD-VASH program. So brought that up. I've learned, or I've heard over the last few weeks also, just the idea of eligibility for the veterans and their eligibility within various types of programs and units, the interplay between HUD-VASH, low-income housing tax credit projects, things like that we could streamline to make housing opportunities for veterans even better for our tribal community. So working on that and working on some of those issues as well. I guess I'll pause right here. Does anyone have any questions yet about just NAHAZA generally or HUD-VASH generally? I think the next slide is going to go into kind of looking forward. The next two big projects that we're going to be working on is the FY22 budget and appropriation cycle, and the infrastructure cycle that I'm sure you've seen in the news. But any questions so far?
I guess, Tony, that was going to be my question. What do you hear about the infrastructure bills and what share of maybe the $213 billion that might go to Indian housing that's floating around? I know there's not a lot of specific legislative language yet, but all the offices are busy working on that. So maybe you're going to get to that here in this next portion.
Yeah, so we can just jump to that real quick and then go back to the FY22. I think infrastructure is probably going to be in the news sooner maybe than the appropriation cycle. So Dave mentioned Biden's administration's plan, infrastructure plan, contained over 200 billion, that should say billion there, for housing generally. Right now, from some of the drafts that I've seen, and there was a draft at the Financial Services Committee about 3 weeks ago, they included $2 billion for the Indian Housing Block Grant. So, that's only, unfortunately, 1%, maybe even a little less, because I think the overall housing plan asked for more than $200 billion. But, $2 billion is still a pretty high number for our tribal housing programs to utilize, but I think we can see some room for growth there. I think this whole idea for infrastructure is a kind of a 10-year infrastructure plan. I don't think it's entirely a one-shot or one-year injection of funds for infrastructure. So I think certainly we want to see some growth in that number. We've worked with NCAI and some of our other organizations to advocate for more than that. Utilizing some of NCAI's work in the past on infrastructure, their estimate was considerably higher. There was about 33 billion needed generally for tribal housing to catch up or to get us where we want to be. So when we sent letters to the Hill over this past few weeks, that was kind of the number that we started at, because that was the last number that one of the organizations has really put some work into on developing. So we started there. We'll continue to work with folks on the Hill and find a better number for everyone involved to something that gets tribes where we want our communities to be, right, and get the funding that we think we need to increase our housing opportunities. So certainly can grow from the 2 billion. That was kind of the initial marker, and then kind of going back to other. I guess one reason that still at least a positive is that if you look at some of the bills from last Congress on infrastructure, this was a financial services bill. Again, there's only $1 billion for Indian housing block grant. Here they're bumping it up, so they're at least scaling it up to some extent with tribal housing, in addition to the larger housing call for infrastructure funding.
So Tony, do you think in any of the drafts you've seen that $2 billion is going straight into the NAHASDA IHBG? Is that your understanding for the proposal?
Yeah, and one of the few drafts I've seen, that's how it's worded. It's straight into the Indian Housing Block Grant, which would be the formula fund. I don't think there's any, from what I saw, there wasn't any kind of discretion between that block grant, ICBG, others. I know with a lot of the COVID relief package, we've seen it kind of divided up in these different pots, and that has its pros and cons, of course. But I think everyone is usually happier to see it go to the block grant, because that's got the most flexibility for tribes to use that funding how they need to see it used in their community. So, but happy to have more conversations about that moving forward, or how we should be breaking these up if we need to into different pots of money. I think we did see the issue, of course, with the COVID rental assistance, right? We'll get to that in a moment. But we've got a big pot of money for tribes as a set aside. Some tribal communities just may not be able to use that based on the circumstances of rental programs in their areas. So, directing things to the block grant is usually our safest bet, and I think it's what people understand the most on the Hill as well, because they're all aware that that's the most common resource for tribes.
We noticed out of the 213 billion, there was kind of a general bullet point that somewhere between 50 and 70 billion would go towards renovation and rehabilitation of federally assisted housing. And again, don't know how that's shaking out in the bill language, but that seems to be a separate pot of money directed at all federally assisted housing, which obviously would include, the NAHASDA housing as well, any existing units. And it would be interesting to see if they're doing an Indian set aside of that portion. For instance, 2% of that, just 50 billion, would be another $2.5 billion right there, specifically for renovation and rehab of existing housing units.
Yeah, I think that's it's an important piece of it. I think if we see bits like that are kind of standalone packages for a discrete issue, we're always trying to make sure tribes are included or have a set aside in there. It's kind of the pros and cons of trying to make sure tribes are included in some form or fashion. Sometimes they'll point us back to IHBG sometimes, and we try to push back on that, of course. But I think that's how the second COVID package kind of maneuvered, right? So that you had the American Rescue Plan, where we saw we didn't necessarily need more rental assistance program funds. They were pumping a lot more money into that as a national program, but rather than do that, they at least put it into a new IHBG portion. Whether or not we would have got that IHBG portion at the amount that it was, or if we would have got it all, it's an open question. So we're always just trying to push up as much as we can across the board for tribal housing programs. So we'll continue to do that, but it's a lot of give and take sometimes.
Right. It'd be glad to get a nice big share of, or at least a reasonable share of that money that's specifically tagged for those kind of capital improvements. Obviously, something that the NAHASDA's never kept up with. So. Yeah,
and I know that's been a common question from the Hill over the years too, right? So that a lot of staffers on the Hill, a lot of representative senators, they'll see the amount going to tribes annually, and they kind of wonder, why there's still the housing shortage. They don't understand that tribes are, using that money to do all of the above, right? They're doing all that maintenance and upkeep and upgrades and infrastructure. So they don't necessarily recognize that for what it is. And, it's our job to try to educate them on that. There's some other questions in the chat feature about the infrastructure package, and there's really just not a whole lot of details quite yet. There's a few drafts kind of that are out. The Biden administration was really just a loose framework for infrastructure package. They kind of tasked the folks on the Hill to, craft the actual programs and funding provisions that folks or that programs would receive through an infrastructure package. So still kind of combing through a lot of that. A lot of it's still in kind of draft form. I think it's, it's kind of hit a roadblock generally in the sense that the price tag of it is something that's up in the air, particularly if they're trying to get, bipartisan support for this type of package and moving forward, if they're going to use kind of a similar legislative process as they did for the rescue plan. So still a ways to go. I think a lot of time for us to chime in on tribes, but of course we want to make sure we're getting in as quickly as we can and making the numbers as good as they are at the beginning of the process. So continue to work on that. Any other questions about infrastructure? So the other portion on this slide is the other big project coming up in our work with the Hill is just the FY22 budget cycle. Typically now we would have, we would have gotten a full proposal for the next fiscal year from the administration. The committees would be doing their letter writing and markup at a committee level. Really kind of a slower process because this is the first year of the Biden administration coming in. I don't believe I've seen any of the actual budget justification documents yet that we get a lot more detail, but on calls and on some overall fact sheets from the White House, they're proposing $900 million for tribal housing. And that is a small increase over what we've been seeing the last couple of years. I did ask if that was just IHBG or if it's going to be a combination of all of the other types of housing funding. And it sounded like it is a consolidated number. So this would cover IHBG, ICDBG, competitive grant, probably some of the loan guarantee programs as well. So it's a bit of a bump. It's hopefully getting us to where we'd like to see this as an annual amount of funding. I think right now, I've largely been sticking with our inflation index compared to what NAHASDA program should have been receiving over the last 2 decades or 25 years now. And it's right about $1 billion or maybe a little less, 900 and something million dollars a year. So we're getting closer and closer. If you add up all the programs, obviously the IHBG itself isn't quite that high. But working towards that as the goal. And, looking back at the years, I think, doing the calculation, I tried to do this a few weeks ago. I don't remember it off the top of my head, but, if you add up all the years that we didn't have that inflationary add-on or what equal funding would have been, tribes have missed out on, I think, over $2.5 billion over the 20 years as it adds up each year on the kind of the static funding for IHBG. So certainly missed out on a lot. Another metric that we've been sharing with the Hill as they talk about infrastructure and other things, just saying, look, we left tribal housing programs behind, this much already. So we need to at least, as we're considering new funding, getting tribes to an equal footing. So a lot of that work going in. I can try to share some of those documents and budget sheets as we go forward after this call, because I think it's all those are good talking points on when we're talking with the Hill on how much funds tribal housing programs should get. So that's kind of the budget proposal. Obviously this budget proposal is a much better starting point for conversations than the prior administration's budgets were. If you looked at the prior administration, each budget was asking for $600 million or so for IHBG. So it's a much lower ask. The past few years, Congress, never accepted those cuts and, kept tribal housing programs either level funded, or we did see some gains over the last few years as well. So, Congress is well aware of its responsibility as well. And, but hopefully, getting a starting point of $900 million and for tribal housing programs is a much better starting point. And we can certainly work with the Hill on, meeting that goal versus just kind of keeping the status quo. So certainly appreciate the administration's budget in that regard, and think it's a great step forward. And I think that's true for a lot of housing programs across HUD, and not just tribal programs, and probably a lot of federal programs across the board, to be honest. So certainly appreciate some of the starting points the new administration's come in with. Any questions about other bills or other infrastructure? I think there's one more that I forgot to mention. We've been working with some folks on kind of reviving the USDA set-aside legislation. If you remember, I think 2 Congresses ago, I believe it was Senator Heitkamp at the time, had introduced a tribal bill that had some housing programs, had some USDA programs in there mixed in, and it had set-asides for USDA programs, and it also had language in there utilizing native CDFIs as intermediaries. So we're working on reviving that again. I think we're pretty close to seeing a draft of that bill being introduced on the Senate, working with some of the other native housing orgs and the native CDFI network as well, and making sure that would work for our tribal programs across the board, whether it's housing or CDFI. So that's a promising bill. I think that's could be a bipartisan bill as well. I know there's a lot of interest in that program and making sure that our federal programs that are already having money appropriated. And this, I don't think one of the attractive things about these types of bills, they don't usually ask for more funding or more money, but it's making sure that our communities are being included. So that usually gets a lot more bipartisan support, easier things for some of our Republican members to support, because it's not new money, but it's just directing money to some of our tribal and rural communities. And that usually helps getting bipartisan support. So we're excited about that. I think we'll have hopefully more to talk about on that next time we meet, but happy to share any info that I have about that, over the next coming weeks, as well as we kind of finalize, what that language could look like or should look like moving forward. So that's the last bill I think I've got. I think we'll move next to some discussions on the Treasury programs, but I'll stop there real quick, see if there's any other comments or questions about some of the pending legislation we've seen. So this is the emergency rental assistance. I think this is a slide from last call, so I don't know that I've updated it much. I don't know that there's been any kind of specific changes in the past month. I know, everyone's interested in curious how this is happening, and myself included. I like to open it up here to hear how some of your guys' rental assistance programs are running. If you think you're worried about not being able to spend that funding, we'd like to hear that. I think we're going to send a survey out in the next week or so as well, to try to garner some of that information from our members. Whether it's being used, if it's being used on rent, utilities. Will you be able to use set amounts by certain timeframes? The program as a whole has been extended, so people who receive these grants have longer to use them now through September 30th of 2022, which is 9 months extra, I believe. But it's an open question, I think, still on when the reallocation provisions can kick in. Under the first bill, there's a reallocation provision for this September 30th, where if certain grantees haven't spent a certain percentage of their funds, Treasury Department could start reallocating some of those grants to other grantees, and for us, it would be within the tribal side. So, tribes aren't going to lose any money to outside grantees, but, certain tribes who may be utilizing the fund, in a quicker way may be able to receive more, but that would be at the expense of another tribe. So certainly we don't want to see that happen, in the sense that we don't want any tribe to be left out. We want to make sure all these funds are being used in the best way possible for the most tribal communities. But there's an open question on when that reallocation provision might kick in, what that might look like. So I know there's a lot of concern from tribes about there, because it was a little bit slow going, as a lot of tribes were waiting for more guidance from Treasury on what was eligible expenses. So I would like to open it up here. If there's anyone on the call who's had some experience with the rental assistance program, if it's working well, I'd like to hear that. If it's not working well, you think you might need more time. I've seen some emails and gotten some questions about or concerns about the reallocation. So I'd be happy to open it up here if anyone's got any thoughts. Well, the silence must mean the programs are going great across the country, across Indian country. Like I said, we're going to try to send a survey out. We certainly want to know which tribes are being more successful or seeing better results in their rental assistance. This is a lot of money that went to tribal programs. I think this was more than your annual IHBG allocation, and this was just for rental assistance and utility assistance. So we were very interested in seeing how it's getting used. We want to make sure it's getting used, but if it's not, we want to make sure we're advocating for the right type of solutions to either keep that money within tribal communities and expand the uses. There was some language in early drafts that would allow tribes to do that. That got taken out before the final passage, but something we'll certainly continue to advocate for if we need to. But hopefully you guys will see that survey in the next week or two. I would encourage all of your members in the regions to do that, or try to work with the regional housing associations as well to kind of echo out that survey for a few weeks. Just to get as much data as we can, because we know a lot of people are looking at the program, not just the tribal side, but the larger rental assistance program, because it's so large, it's going to have a lot of scrutiny. So we want to make sure, at least the tribal side, we're doing what we can to make sure tribes are able to spend that. I see a few things in the chat coming through about some challenges they've seen, and I'll try to catalog those and share that. I think we have had some eligibility I think benefits. I think there's some new language that we've seen out of the Treasury Department saying if an individual or a family is eligible for under existing program, you may not need to redocument a lot of their eligibility criteria. So hopefully that helps if you're having trouble with that. But a program this big, you may be helping families that weren't being assisted before, so it probably wouldn't alleviate in that instance. But we'll send that survey out. Hopefully we get a lot of responses, and hopefully that'll lead to a lot of helpful discussions with Treasury on making sure that program is running as smoothly as it can. Feel free to interrupt here. I'm going to jump to the Homeowner Assistance Fund. I don't have the most information on this, and I know a lot of you have been waiting for information on this. I think we've had some false starts, I think, over the last few weeks from Treasury on this Homeowner Assistance Fund program, trying to get the allocations out. I think, one, they want to make sure we're not seeing some of the same issues with the rental program, where some tribes may not have been aware or felt left out. They missed the deadline. So there's supposed to be a portal that's opening for tribes to enter their information in and secure their allocation. The formula and the allocations should be set because it's based on the existing IHBG formulas for this Homeowner Assistance Fund. So the allocations are there, but I think each tribe still needs to go in and kind of claim their allocation within a certain time frame. I believe the time frame is pretty relaxed this time. I believe it's September 30th. I'll try to confirm a lot of these. I'm a little reluctant to say some dates on some of these because I don't want to get wrong information. But I know there was some kind of false starts on the portal opening. I think they had originally said it was going to be open by April 30th and wanted some applications in by April 30th, and wasn't even open, I think, until earlier this week. But I think I've heard that there was a new letter or email that went out to the points of contact with tribes. I think there's a little bit of an issue where Treasury, because they haven't worked with housing programs to the greatest extent in the past, they're relying on some of the existing tribal government contacts that they've had for other Treasury programs and funds. So there may be some kind of miscommunication there. So if you're on this call from a housing program perspective, you might want to reach out to some of the other groups within your tribe to see if they've been getting information on this from Treasury, because I think they're trying to be somewhat, a little bit selective on who gets it, because they also had the issue where, multiple points of contact within a single tribe were applying for the funds when it's really just meant for one department or one group. And it's up to the tribe who does that. But I think for the rental program, because it was so rushed, I think we did see a number of tribes apply twice, in the sense that two different points of contact within the tribe were putting their information in. So I think there's trying to fix that issue and address that issue. But again, that leaves kind of some confusion, I think, as well, by some of the housing staff or programs maybe not getting all that information right away. I think under the way this program has been operated, and I would welcome anyone to jump in and correct me if you've been working on the applications already. I think the way I've seen it described is that once you kind of submit your application, you'll get or claim your allocation. So you'll get probably about 10% of that kind of readily available. And then to, I guess, receive the entire allocation that your tribe is eligible for, you'd have to submit a more detailed homeowners assistance plan. And I don't know the details of that. We're going to try to work with Treasury to get some more guidance out. I know that's something they're still working on as well. So that's kind of the details that I know off the top of my head. I do believe there's a longer time for tribes to claim their allocation, so they can do that and not feel so rushed. But I know it's just now starting, and I know this is a program that we've heard tribes have been interested in, because when the rental assistance program started back in January, a lot of what I heard was that is mortgages available through that, and it wasn't at the time because it was a rental program, but now there's a homeowner program. We know this is an in-demand program for tribes. A lot of programs across the country have, mortgage, tribal, rent-to-own programs. So a lot of your members in, tribal housing, may be homeowners in some form or fashion. So this program is going to be helpful as that as well. So any other thoughts or comments or questions that I can, relay over? I'm not sure if there's anyone from Treasury on the call. I think they were waiting to see some of the responses on this application portal that went live this week, but certainly we'll try to get them on a future call. We did have Deputy Assistant Secretary last call as well, so we're encouraged by their desire to work with tribes and have these interactions. So we'll certainly keep inviting, and I think we'll get more information from them. And we all want these programs to succeed. So we're certainly happy with how Treasury has been working and communicative. Certainly see some hiccups here or there, but that's true for most programs. So if you got issues, let me know, and we can bring it up here on this call. And I certainly just want to relay any issues that tribes are hearing or seeing on the ground level to our friends at Treasury. I see some comments in the chat just talking about how this is a little bit more detailed than the rental assistance program. I think the rental assistance program was quite simple. I think you were pretty much just putting in your bank information and some signing some documents saying you're going to use the funds for eligible expenses, which I'm sure will be tracked more on the back end. But here I think they're trying to at least have some more formality to the program from the start. But anyone have any first thoughts about the program that they'd like to share, or any issues you've seen?
Tony, I just mentioned that from the information they put out this week, it looks like rather than opening a custom portal like they did for the emergency rental assistance program, they're piggybacking on some existing systems. So the registering into those systems, what they call a real ID system for Treasury, they passed out a 37-page instruction manual on how to open one of those accounts, and apparently they're going to use that to accept the documents for the HAF. But it requires a lot more information than the emergency rental assistance program did, including stuff like a credit check and maybe some background information on the individuals who are going to be the point people for the program. So it would be worthwhile for tribes that haven't had a chance to review that information to go through that guidance first, or that instruction first, because you're probably going to have to pull together information from many different departments and decide how you're going to do that. But like I say, it looks like they're recycling maybe an existing Treasury program data collection system to use for the HAF here.
And I'd have to go back and look at the statute. I know for the rental program, there were some different reporting that were, I wouldn't say relaxed. They recognized that tribal reporting under rental assistance may look different. So there was some flexibility there on reporting. I don't know that language made it into the homeowner assistance fund provisions, the second bill. So I'd have to double check that. But it may be that, your tribe may be stuck with whatever reporting was envisioned for everyone, particularly if it's, piggybacking off of an existing type program. But certainly something we can bring up with Treasury and work with them on. I think there was some language about consultation there with tribes as well, and I think they're open to that. And so we'll continue to work on that. We've also been working with Treasury on possible training in TA. The rescue plan that passed in mid-March, I believe, had some funding dedicated for training in TA for the larger programs, and we want to make sure tribes are included in that in some form or fashion. So we're still working with them on how, making quality training in TA videos or sessions or on-site interactions, even if that's necessary moving forward. But like I said, they've been wanting to be helpful, and certainly it's kind of probably a learning curve for them working with tribal housing programs, because I don't think it's something we've worked with Treasury on a lot in the past. But,
Tony, just to let you know, UNIHA recently produced its own region-wide training through the HUD TNTA system. For all of the new programs, ERA, HAF, and some of the others that are anticipated under the infrastructure bills. And they have, the UNIHA administrators are putting that through the process to see if it can be categorized as a general training available through NAIC and HUD. And that training network, for the same reason, trying to accelerate that connection between Indian country and Treasury. HUD's only issues with it are how we have to keep explaining why it's relevant to use HUD training money potentially to develop those training programs. Again, because a lot of the people that are doing the TNTA evaluations for Community Compass and the other training programs are not directly attached to ONAP, so they are not aware of how those Treasury funds are affecting all the NAHASDA-based housing that the TDHEs are managing.
Yeah. We had similar discussions with our folks at HUD too on what's eligible under the different streams of training, TA budgets and funding. So still working through that out, but there is a pot of money at Treasury as well. So hopefully we can access that at some level too if we need to. So hopefully we'll get more and more information as that continues on. Because the portal just went live this week, I think there's probably not a lot of questions yet. I saw some things in the chat about one just being longer, more involved, and Dave was talking about that. I saw something about community engagement being a bigger part of it as well. Similar, we tried to get a few rental assistance program policies and application forms, things like that, from different tribes that we knew were implementing the rental assistance program. We put those on our website. Always welcome to see more. So if some of you have tribal policies for the rental assistance or the homeownership or homeowner assistance fund, we'd be happy to see those, share those with other tribes. I think that's what we want to continue to be a resource there that kind of has that, as an index for tribes to look through and come to and see which policies are out there, what other tribes are using, and see what fits their communities as well. So certainly encourage any of you on the call, if you have these policies in place or you're constructing them, share them with us. I'm sure we can kind of help expedite some dialogue between agencies too, if you guys have open questions about some of your policies. But we want to just make sure that tribes have as much information as they can, so they can see different examples and things that may fit their communities as well. So certainly invite and encourage any of you to let us know if your policies are working or how they're working, so we can share those with others. I think I try to skip to the next slide. There's really not another slide. I know there's been some news just on the administrative front. There was a handful of consultations in March and April. I believe there was the ICDBG award earlier in April as well. I don't have that in front of me, but anything else that we should be looking at for now, or to get updates out to you guys about? I know we send out our newsletters every 2 weeks. I haven't been able to put a lot of advocacy stuff or updates in those the last probably 2 weeks or so, or two NHU. So, I guess the open question is, what are you guys looking for updates on that we can help get information out to you guys on in the next couple of weeks before the next call? Because I know we got some catching up to do. When the new administration came in, there was a flurry of activity with consultations, some grant announcements. So happy to kind of catch up here and see what you guys are missing. And so we'll try to help fill those gaps if there's any questions or open topics that you guys would like to learn more about. And I do see another question in the chat about the homeowner assistance fund, kind of paying the tribe as well. I know some tribes do have programs where they're the lender or they're kind of the title holder until certain benchmarks are meant to turn title over. So that is something we'll continue to look at and look for guidance on. But I think it's promising that the rental program had that, spelled that out. And I think it's something that we'll hopefully see some guidance. I'd have to look at the existing guidance. I haven't had a chance to really see what's out there about that type of question, but it's a good question, and we'll continue to look into that. See some other questions about just access to that Treasury Homeownership Assistance Fund portal. And I don't know off the top of my head, maybe others on the call may have some experience. If the other tribal government contacts who are more engaged on the CRF fund, which is the tribal government fund, if that has some relationship here, I don't want to confuse folks even more, but you may just want to, reach out to some of the other folks within your tribe to see, what type of credentials they've used with Treasury in the past as well, to see if that's helpful here, or at least, know the difference. And again, I think for anyone who hasn't seen something from Treasury on the Homeowner Assistance Fund, you may want to reach out to others within your tribe because they may be on Treasury's contact list and not the housing program specifically. So certainly, I would encourage you guys to work within your own tribe to see who's getting that information from Treasury. I see some questions there about just the ICDBG timeframes. We'll try to get some better answers regarding that. I know it's tough to plan kind of your overall years and cycles of planning and construction if you don't necessarily know the timeframes of some of these grant opportunities. So try to get information with that. I know some of the regional housing programs or housing associations and myself have been pretty regular calls with HUD and the ONAP office. So that's certainly something I'll bring up here just on timeframes, just generally moving forward and what tribes might be able to expect if there's hopefully a calendar moving forward on when these opportunities might come up, just to get people a better idea and let them know that that's an issue. I think with so much funding from different programs coming to tribes, you certainly want to try to get as much straight as you can on what's available and when and how that impacts your overall planning. So it's certainly something we'll bring up on our next call with HUD. I know a lot of you guys are having your quarterly or regular regional housing association meetings. So feel free to reach out to us on any updates. Most of them are already or were included, or our board members for the regions are giving those updates. So, let us know if you need anything else from NEIHC's perspective. Happy to participate in those as well. And like I said, most of those, they've been reaching out to us and getting updates from us already. So, we just want to make sure that you guys are getting as much information as you can. I know there's a lot coming out from different places, so we're trying to consolidate and make it as streamlined as it can be, so you guys can see, what all is out there. And you can always get better at that. But there's a lot going on these first few months of the year with everything kind of changing with the administration and Congress being pretty active. So I want to make sure you guys are getting as much information as you can, and do that in these calls, your regional association calls or what have you. But we're always happy to just pick up the phone if you've got a question you have for us. So don't hesitate to reach out to me or staff by phone or email as well. See some other helpful links there in the chat, just on links to Treasury documents and things, and hopefully we'll have a little bit more in-depth discussion on some of the details. And if you guys do have issues over the next month, don't hesitate to reach out to us with any questions that we can relay on to Treasury or HUD or any other program that you're working with. Announcements we usually do are pretty general. The next few Ledge Committee meetings, we usually do these the first Thursday of each month, so it's June 3rd. I put July 8th there because it's the second Thursday, but I know sometimes people take the July 4th kind of as a long holiday weekend, so I moved it from the 1st to the 8th just because most people will probably be back in the office by then, and then August 5th. So those are the next few meetings. Still working on our overall event schedule. NEIHC, we had to postpone or cancel our 2021 annual conference. We're just kind of postponing that venue for a couple of years out, and we'll return there. But our next in-person event will be NEIHC Legal Symposium in December. Still working on a few virtual style events as well. Hopefully some of you participated in the Legal Symposium last year, which was virtual. If you have any comments on that, let us know. But we may be doing some more virtual events over the summer and fall as well, just to make sure you guys are getting ample formats or forums to get some content to you, whether it's legislative or advocacy related. I think one of the events we're contemplating is something to take the place of the legislative conference, which we missed out on in February this year. I know a lot of you like to hear from the elected officials, senators, representatives, and get that directly from them on what they're prioritizing and how they can get help from us and how they can help our program. So that's one of the events we're looking at trying to put on, and the logistics of that in this day and age, getting senators, representatives to participate in the Zoom meeting, pros and cons in and of itself. So working on something like that over the summer and fall months, but these are the next events that we've got going on. We have the Native Housing Update going out every 2 weeks as our newsletter. So let us know if you're missing any information there, or you think we'd like to add more information to those newsletters, let us know. Appreciate everyone's time this afternoon and morning for some of you. Look forward to talking with you through the next month before the next meeting. If you've got any ideas or questions, let us know at NEIHC. Feel free to reach out anytime. Otherwise, I'll see you all on June the 3rd.